We're not immortal beings. Nobody gets out alive, but I think our goal is to live the longest, healthiest life we can, and we can leave a lasting impact, make the world a better place, and, keep advancing the science to where we can live a longer, healthier life. Processed foods, sugar, grains, simple carbohydrates completely shut down nitric oxide production.
Dr. Nathan Bryan is a professor of molecular medicine and world-leading expert in nitric oxide research and biology. Dr. Bryan, it's a huge honor to have you with us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
Thank you. And my first question is, what is nitric oxide and why is it so important?
Nitric oxide is a signaling molecule. It's naturally produced, but interestingly, it's a gas. It's one of the few gaseous signaling molecules in the human body. But it sort of serves an enormous regulator of many biological functions that are related to health and longevity. So it was first discovered as a vasodilator, meaning that when it's produced, it relaxes the smooth muscle of blood vessels and leads to blood vessel dilation. So now we can improve oxygen delivery and circulation and nutrient delivery to every organ, tissue, and cell in the body. But it mitigates inflammation. It downregulates adhesion molecules. It mobilizes stem cells. It's how our immune system kills off invading pathogens from bacteria and viruses. It's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, and it activates and regulates mitochondrial energy production in every cell. So it's a critically important, what we call a foundational molecule for health and wellness.
Could you explain the pathophysiology between nitric oxide deficiency and endothelial dysfunction?
Well, we call endothelial dysfunction, or we call nitric oxide deficiency endothelial dysfunction. And the reason for that is there's an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. And as the name implies, that enzyme produces or synthesizes nitric oxide gas. And that enzyme is found in the endothelial cells, the cells that line all blood vessels throughout the entire body. And so when we develop endothelial dysfunction, which means that those cells become dysfunctional. So that means they no longer respond to normal stimuli, like acetylcholine, bradykinin, endothelial agonist. It means that they lose their barrier function. And then, you get extravasation of immune molecules and lipids that lead to smooth muscle hyperplasia and cardiovascular disease. So really what we're looking at is the function of the NOS enzyme. So nitric oxide deficiency, in terms of medical diagnosis, we call that endothelial dysfunction. And we know when looking through the entire medical and scientific literature that endothelial dysfunction is one of the earliest events in the onset and progression of most, if not all, chronic disease. And we understand that mechanistically and biochemically because when your body loses the ability to produce nitric oxide, you start to get blood vessel stiffening or arterial stiffness. You start to get plaque deposition. You start to lose the regulation of blood flow. You start to get high blood pressure and inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And in fact, we find that the functional loss of nitric oxide in the endothelium precedes these structural changes we see in people with cardiovascular disease by many years, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years earlier. So if you have high blood pressure, if you have erectile dysfunction, if you have diagnosed cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, obstructive coronary disease, then that indicates to us that you've been nitric oxide deficient for many years. And so if you start to develop these subtle symptoms, ED and elevation in blood pressure, then that's really your body telling you that you're losing the production of nitric oxide.
Mhm. Is it that those metabolic diseases like hypertension and diabetes causes endothelial damage and that leads to lower nitric oxide, or is it the chronic deficiency in nitric oxide leads to endothelial dysfunction and that leads to metabolic diseases? So do you know which causes which first, or what starts
It's the chicken or
first?
the egg, right?
Yes.
No, it's really the loss of nitric oxide, but then it's a feed forward mechanism. So what we and others have published on and discovered is that when you lose the production of nitric oxide, then you no longer get normal blood vessel dilation and you lose the arterial compliance. So in young, healthy, normal people who make nitric oxide, with each beat of the heart, the purpose of really the resistance arteries and the conduit arteries is to dampen that pulse wave with each beat. So as long as your blood vessels are soft and compliant, they dampen that pulse wave. And so we will look at it pulse wave analysis, that with each heartbeat, it sends a pulse along the entire vascular tree. And if you've got stiff blood vessels, that pulse wave travels really fast and it can damage the endothelium. But if it makes nitric oxide, it's soft and compliant, so it dampens that wave, and we can look at pulse wave analysis and see and look at arterial stiffness at either resistance or secondary or tertiary arterioles. So that sets the cascade. But then once you develop endothelial dysfunction, it further suppresses nitric oxide production. And then you start to get a rapid increase in blood pressure, and you start to get disruptions in cell signaling and insulin signaling, for example, and develop insulin resistance. So what we're finding is that metabolic disease and insulin resistance, and really what we call metabolic syndrome, an elevation in blood pressure, triglycerides, and fasting glucose, is really a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. Because if you restore loss of nitric oxide explains all of those, and restoration of nitric oxide can actually correct all of those.
How does our lifestyle and diet affect nitric oxide production?
Well, it dictates optimal nitric oxide production. And, we see this especially in the US, people eating a Western diet, we see a rapid decline in nitric oxide production. Populations in the Mediterranean region, in Italy, for example, and even Japan, a Japanese diet, we find that those dietary patterns are actually facilitating and activating nitric oxide production. Where to the contrast, the American diet, high in processed foods, sugar, grains, simple carbohydrates, completely shut down nitric oxide production. So it's the foods we eat, it's the elimination of sugar, it's cardioprotective foods and dietary patterns. And then it's also lifestyle. Certain things we do like, oral hygienic practices, fluoride, antiseptic mouthwash, even drug therapy, things like antacids, cholesterol lowering medications, and some other drug therapies completely shut down nitric oxide production.
Which food naturally supports nitric oxide production? And specifically, I want to ask about beetroot, as in
Yeah.
raw beetroot vegetable, because that's one of the famous that it improves nitric oxide production.
Well, I think what we're learning is there's not really one primary food that's a great stimulator activator of nitric oxide production, because there's so many things that determine that. It's the soil conditions, it's the time of harvest, it's where they're grown, it's the amount of sunlight, it's lightning storms in the atmosphere that lead to nitrogen assimilation in the soil. But what we're finding is that it's the simple elimination of sugar or anything that leads to an increase in blood sugar completely shuts down nitric oxide production. But you mentioned beets, and beets, back in 2012 in the London Olympic Games was when beets kind of hit the scene, because there was some data coming out of the UK showing, and these investigators were collaborators of mine and good friends and colleagues. They were taking a beet juice standardized in nitrate. So really nitrate is the kind of the dosimeter in beets, and they were treating athletes with it, and they could see an improvement in performance that could be explained by an increase in mitochondrial ATP production and this ratio of ATP and ADP. So we were improving the energetics, the mitochondrial energetics, and changing the anaerobic threshold and improving tissue oxygenation. And when you're an athlete, that's what you want, because you can enhance performance. You can go longer, stronger, faster, and faster recovery. And so then in 2012, it was realized that many of these athletes were drinking liters and liters of beetroot juice. And the downside of that was causing a lot of gastric discomfort and diarrhea, their urine and feces turning red, and people thinking they had, colonic bleeds or urinary bleeds. And so then every company, the market was flooded with beetroot products, beetroot juice, beetroot powders. And so I started testing a lot of these products on the market because I understood the science. And what we found, about 9 out of 10, 95% of the beet products on the market, we couldn't detect any nitrate or nitrite in these beet products. Because, it's not the beets themselves. There's certain components in the beets that have to be maintained from harvest to drying to the finished product that have to be maintained in order to produce nitric oxide when consumed. And most of these companies were just buying cheap beetroot powder, putting it on the market and selling it. But the people weren't getting a benefit from it, especially the athletes.
Mhm.
So beets are popular in terms as a source of nitric oxide, but the problem is most of the products on the market provide no nitric oxide benefit. In fact, we call these dead beets. And when we did a lot of our randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials using beet, we would use a lot of these commercial beet products that you can buy off the shelf in the whole in the pharmacy or health food stores, and we use them as placebos in our clinical trials because they're a perfect placebo. They're beetroot products that provide no nitric oxide benefit. And so I think, consumers and buyers have to beware because they have to understand that all beets aren't created equal, right?
Mhm.
We have to understand what's required in that so that when consumers take these products, they actually get a nitric oxide benefit. And the other interesting thing is if you're looking just at nitrate, nitrate is inert in humans. And so if you don't have the right microbiome in the mouth and the gut, then when humans consume nitrate, they sweat it out. It's excreted in the urine, in the feces, and the sweat. It's completely inert in humans. And that's why it's important to understand the individual microbiome, to have sufficient stomach acid production in order to get the benefits of not just beets, but green leafy vegetables from many other foods that confer a nitric oxide benefit. But all that's dependent upon is there enough nitrate in the food? Do we have the right oral microbiome? And is our stomach able to secrete stomach acid production to allow for this pathway to be intact and actually produce nitric oxide from it?
The beetroot itself, the raw vegetable, should we eat more of it given that it's harvested in a right way?
Well, there may be better ways. So number one, I mean, beets, if you look at the data, is the third least liked vegetable in the world. I don't know what the top two are. They must be pretty bad because if they're beating beets in terms of their likability or palatability. Um, Number two, beets are high in oxalates. So if people are prone to kidney stones, they could start throwing stones because of the oxalic acid. And then number three, it depends upon, you know, geographical differences. We published a paper in 2015 showing that the amount of nitrate in vegetables grown in, the South or the Midwest is completely different than vegetables grown in the Northeast, for example. Sometimes a 50 to 80 fold difference in the nitrate content of that same vegetable bought at the same retail grocer. So it's almost impossible to predict if the foods you're eating at retail grocers have enough nitrate to actually produce nitric oxide. And so that's why, and in the US, at least, I don't know about in other regions or other countries, but the vegetables that are grown in the US today compared to the 1940s, there's 73% less nutrients in the food grown in the US over the past 80 years.
Yeah.
So the food we eat in America are completely depleted of most micronutrients. And I think that's what's contributing to, at least in part, to the chronic diseases we see in the US, in most westernized worlds.
One of your interviews, you talked about a surprising fact for me that some of the organic crops may contain less nitrate than ones that are organic, which is surprising. You would expect it the other way around.
Yeah, that was a surprising finding from that 2015 paper
Yes.
because we not only looked at conventionally grown vegetables. And in the US, there's two categories, and probably every country may have their own regulations and labeling requirements. But you have conventionally grown vegetables and you have organically grown vegetables. And at least in the US, conventionally means that you can add fertilizer to them. There's really no restrictions. If you want to add herbicides or pesticides to them, then you can. Organic, on the other hand, there's restrictions on, obviously, you can't add herbicides or pesticides, but there's a restriction on adding nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil. So without a standardization of nitrogen added to the soil, then there's no way to predict how much nitrogen is in the soil so that vegetables to assimilate nitrogen in the form of nitrate. So what organic farmers do is they add compost, they add manure, but again, there's no standardization of that. And so what we're finding is that organic obviously doesn't have herbicides or pesticides, which is a good thing, so you're not
Mhm.
exposed to the toxins. But without knowing specifically how much nitrogen is in the soil, then there's less nitrogen in the form of nitrate in organically grown vegetables. And we see this across the board. So now that creates a kind of a paradox, right? You want to eat organic because you don't want to be exposed to the herbicides and pesticides, which completely destroy the microbiome, their mitochondrial toxins, and cause a lot of health problems. But you also want to eat vegetables that are replete in basic nutrients. So what I do is I grow my own vegetables, right? I do soil samples, I send it off, they tell me what's depleted in the soil, and then I add it back. And I add standardized amount of nitrogen to the soil. So in that case, they're not considered organic, but the foods that I raise in my garden, I don't add any herbicides, pesticides, or anything to it. So they're not considered organic, but they're nutrient dense. So really, the answer, I guess, is to go to your local farmers market, buy locally, ask your farmers how are they growing these foods? Are they testing their soil to make sure that the micronutrients are there? And then when all else fails, you can do individual micronutrient testing to figure out what is your body missing, and then you can either change your diet, add more foods that are on average more enriched in the nutrients that maybe you're deficient in, or you just supplement the body what's missing.
Are there any specific things that you personally look for before buying or consuming fruits and vegetables and other products?
Well, I mean, for me, I'm probably unique in the fact that we grow our own vegetables and we raise our own meat. So what I look for, number one, when we grow our own beef, we take the calf directly from the mother. All it's had is breast milk and grass, and then we finish it on a diet and a nutrition program that's specifically developed by an animal nutritionist. So it's non-GMO foods. We finish them for 150 days, no antibiotics, no hormones. So it's as natural as we can do it. And then, in the vegetables, we just again we do soil samples every year to make sure that the soil that we're growing the vegetables in is replete in nutrients so that when we grow these food and harvest them that they provide all the basic nutrients for us. But I don't know a way that you can do this at a retail grocer where most people, especially living in big cities, can understand or get a sense or
It's
really
nearly
any level of
impossible. Yeah.
confidence. Yeah, it may be impossible. Yeah.
Uh,
No, but the challenge I have in growing a kind of a natural garden with no herbicides or pesticides is, this is hard work. You have to be there every day because
yeah.
the insects or the worms, like my corn crop, if you don't get out there every day, the worms are going to eat all your corn. So, for instance, in GMO crops or crops sprayed with herbicides or pesticides, if the animals and the insects and the worms won't even eat the food, then it's probably not good for
Yes.
humans to consume it
Yes.
because I think that's their natural instinct. If the animals and insects aren't going to eat it, then probably it's not good. But look, it's hard work to grow
Yes.
your own food and have the resources to do that. And you're competing with, the natural forces of insects and worms and people
Yeah.
who
If
or
it
other.
doesn't kill the animal, probably it won't kill you, right?
That's right.
Could you
Yeah.
talk to us about your research showing that mouthwash can impair nitric oxide production?
Yeah. So this goes back probably 25 years and, probably even data that preceded my work showed that there were oral bacteria that were responsible for producing nitric oxide in the lumen of the stomach when people swallowed their saliva. And you could detect this through nitric oxide analyzers. And then they found that if you eradicated the bacteria, you lost the nitric oxide that was detected in the lumen of the acid stomach. So in early 2000, we started looking at the oral microbiome because we were finding that if we could, there was some data coming out that people who use mouthwash or you intentionally use mouthwash, there was a small increase in blood pressure. And so we started in collaboration with the dental school in Houston at the University of Texas School of Medicine and School of Dentistry, Dental Medicine. We started doing tongue scraping to see could we culture these bacteria? Could we find them and did they have any bearing on blood pressure regulation? And so in a paper we published, I believe in 2011, we found that people had the greatest diversity in the oral microbiome. They seemed to have the best blood pressure. And then the people who had the least diverse oral microbiome, where we could not culture any of these known nitrate reducing bacteria, tended to have higher blood pressure. So that was, an association, it's not causation. But it gives us enough data to go in and do additional experiments. So in 2019, we published a paper showing that if we took young, healthy, normal tensive patients And then we did daily tongue scrapings. Then we gave them mouthwash twice a day for 7 days. And then we monitored their blood pressure. We did tongue scrapings, and then stopped the mouthwash for 4 days. And then after 4 days, what happens to their oral microbiome? What happens to their blood pressure? And what we found was that in some cases, that chronic use of mouthwash twice a day for 7 days, we could make normal tensive patients clinically hypertensive. And in fact, one patient, we increased his blood pressure by 26 millimeters of mercury in 1 week, simply by killing the oral microbiome. And we completely eradicated the good bacteria on the crypts of the tongue, and we couldn't culture any of them. And then 4 days later, after stopping the mouthwash, his blood pressure completely normalized. And we were able to pick up and culture the bacteria that were responsible for generating nitric oxide and then regulating blood pressure. So that really created a new paradigm for management of hypertension or blood pressure. Because what we're finding is that the hypertension and the high blood pressure in some people, in some cases, may be a symptom of oral dysbiosis.
Mhm.
And when you look broader in medicine and you look at different classes of antihypertensive medications, so if you have a patient with high blood pressure, goes to the doctor, they put him on an ACE inhibitor, an angiotensin receptor blocker, calcium channel blocker, different classes of antihypertensives. But we know that 50% of the people that are prescribed these prescription medications to manage their blood pressure don't respond with better blood pressure, right? You call that resistant hypertension. They're resistant to therapy. And now what we're finding is that they're resistant because the source of their hypertension isn't due to renin-angiotensin. It's not due to, an upregulation of the angiotensin receptors, and it's not due to a calcium dysregulation. So those drugs will not and cannot work to reduce their blood pressure. So what we're finding is that if we can start to query the patients, do you use fluoride toothpaste? Are you using antiseptic mouthwash? And any other thing that's disrupting the oral microbiome, disrupting nitric oxide production, may be contributing to their increase in blood pressure. So now you can say, okay, if you're using fluoride in your toothpaste, stop. Use a fluoride-free toothpaste. If you're using mouthwash, anything antiseptic, stop. If you're using proton pump inhibitors, stop. And then 30 days later, you come back and remarkably, their blood pressure's more normal or better managed.
Mhm.
So now we're finding this connection between the oral microbiome and the regulation of systemic blood pressure. And that seems to be a complete disconnect between what we teach physicians in medical school and how they treat people with high blood pressure.
Mhm. Other than stopping the mouthwash, antiseptic mouthwash, and the non-fluoride, are there any ways to improve the oral microbiomes?
Yes, so number one, we have to stop doing the things that disrupt the microbiome or destroy the microbiome and then start targeting the microbiome. So there's prebiotics, foods with more nitrate in it. These are nitrate produce reducing bacteria, so we got to give them more substrate to respire on. And then it's elimination of sugar. Sugar causes an acidic saliva. It completely disrupts the ecology of the microbiome, and it's creating more of these caries, cavities causing bacteria, and you start to disrupt the normal ecology. So elimination of sugar, simple carbs, and then the other thing is, those mouth breathers. And because when we breathe through our mouth, again, it fully oxygenates the oral cavity, changes salivary pH, changes the composition of the bacteria. And so for those that are mouth breathing, do nasal breathing, and to change the microbiome. So those are some very simple practices where we can target the microbiome, change the microbiome, enhance nitric oxide production.
Could you talk to us about the danger of chronic antacid use?
Yeah, look, the drugs, the PPIs and acids were, at least in the US, approved only for acute use, 3 to 5 days for the treatment of reflux, gastroesophageal reflux disease. But, at some point over the past 10 or 15 years, the US FDA allowed these to go over the counter to where you don't even have to have a prescription for these drugs. So there were never any long-term studies, safety studies on the chronic use of antacids. So what we're finding now, and these are prospective clinical studies showing that people who have been on PPIs for 3 to 5 years, we're seeing a 30 to 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's. Right? So these are indisputable clinical observations, taking in all the confounders and a very statistically significant association between PPI use, heart attack, strokes, and Alzheimer's. And then when you start to, okay, mechanistically, how do you explain these clinical observations? And what we're finding is that the proton pump inhibitors are completely shutting down nitric oxide production. They lead to an increase in a molecule called asymmetric dimethylarginine, or ADMA, which shuts down endothelial nitric oxide production. And then it's completely shutting down the nitric oxide that's being produced in the lumen of the stomach from our diet. So they're completely shutting down systemic nitric oxide production, causing an increase in blood pressure, increasing inflammation, increasing plaque vulnerability, plaque rupture. There's your heart attack and stroke. It's leading to insulin resistance and loss of cerebral blood flow, focal ischemia in the brain, protein misfolding, and we call that Alzheimer's. So these are very, very dangerous drugs that should never be taken chronically. In fact, I believe, and I've advocated for the past 10 years, that the FDA and these drug companies who are making these drugs should do the responsible thing and completely take them off the market. And if nothing else, have a black box warning on these drugs, because these are worse than the Vioxx, the Celebrex, the COX-2 inhibitors from 25 years ago that were known to be causing increased heart attacks and stroke. And then they were taken off the market for a brief time, and now I believe there's a black box warning showing and demonstrating in your face these drugs have been shown to increase heart attack and stroke. So take with caution. But I think there's no need to. And the other problem, completely unrelated to nitric oxide, is you need stomach acid to break down proteins into amino acids. You need stomach acid to absorb most vitamins and minerals, from B vitamins, selenium, chromium, zinc, iodine. You can't make stomach acid, you can't absorb nutrients, and your body becomes nutrient deficient. And I believe it's causing foodborne allergies and autoimmune disease, because if you can't break down proteins in your diet, whether it's animal protein or plant protein, then these undigested peptide fragments are leaking across the gut. Your body develops an antibody against it, and you develop autoimmune disease. It's simply due to insufficient stomach acid production.
Mhm. And what are other medications that might disrupt the nitric oxide production that are often overlooked?
The main ones are the statins, the cholesterol-lowering medications, because we have to understand cell biology. And I think many physicians forget basic cell biology. Cholesterol is naturally produced in the body. We get it from the foods we eat, from good fats, and then if we're not getting enough from the diet, then our body makes it. And we need cholesterol for brain health to maintain cell membrane integrity and fluidity. So the way cells signal is the cell senses an extracellular signal, and then there's that signal is transduced intracellularly, right? And that's dependent upon enough cholesterol in the cell membrane, fluidity, these lipid rafts where signal is transduced. And when we lose cholesterol in the cell membrane, then we lose that intracellular signaling. And the best example is insulin signaling, because now, again, take important clinical observations. Statins are known to cause type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and they're mitochondrial toxicants, because again, there's an inner membrane within the mitochondria that transfers electrons and maintains an electrical potential, an electrical gradient. And without maintaining that cell membrane, which acts as an insulator in simple physics and electrical conductivity, you lose that insulation, you lose that transmembrane potential, and it's causing a lot of problems. And it's not just nitric oxide production, it's a lot of intracellular signal transduction that's disrupted when your cholesterol gets too low. And that's just on cell signaling. And then, cholesterol is a backbone and a precursor for vitamin D. We make vitamin D from cholesterol. We make testosterone from cholesterol. We make estrogen from cholesterol. And if we don't have enough cholesterol, then we become vitamin D deficient, immunocompromised. We become hormone deficient, and the long list of things that occur from that. So to me, it makes no sense. Cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. I think the verdict is in. Cholesterol does not cause heart disease, so why target it? When it provides no benefit, even all the clinical data, primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, there's no benefit of lowering your cholesterol in terms of heart disease. So if there's no benefit and there's this laundry list of risk, then the quotient is very simple. You don't take these drugs. They provide no benefit and they increase risk.
How does nasal breathing enhance nitric oxide? And for individuals who have chronic nasal blockage on one nostril or the other, what do you recommend them to do to enhance their nitric oxide? Are there any measures that they can take to improve blood flow and nitric oxide in their nostrils?
Yeah. Now, again, I think, again, we take important clinical observations and then try to work backwards and understand mechanism to we can explain that and then optimize it. So nasal breathing has been shown to lower blood pressure, right? Nasal breathing improves tissue oxygenation and can modulate the autonomic nervous system, right? Activate the parasympathetic and kind of balance your autonomic nervous system. So to explain this, again, there's an enzyme, nitric oxide synthase, that's found. In fact, the highest concentration of this enzyme is found in our upper airways, the epithelium of the upper airways and sinuses. So it's that same enzyme that's found in your endothelial cells is also found in our epithelial cells. So if that enzyme is functional and produces nitric oxide when activated, then when we do nasal breathing, nitric oxide is a gas, so it's delivered into the pulmonary circulation. It dilates the pulmonary arteries. It dilates the smooth muscle of the bronchioles. So now you're matching ventilation to perfusion, right? And that's why nasal breathing can improve oxygenation and lower blood pressure and activate or balance your autonomic nervous system. But if you have endothelial dysfunction, again, when the enzyme is uncoupled and dysfunctional, then you have epithelial dysfunction. So you can do nasal breathing, but if the enzyme to make nitric oxide isn't working, then you're not going to produce nitric oxide. And we can measure this through exhaled nitric oxide in people who have endothelial dysfunction. They're not producing any nitric oxide when they're doing nasal breathing.
Mhm.
So then we have to focus on the problem. The problem is a dysfunctional enzyme. So how do we restore the function of the enzyme? So now that when you do nasal breathing, you can actually produce nitric oxide, deliver it into the upper airways, lower airways, and manage ventilation and perfusion. But in people who have an anatomical um structure, an anatomical problem that's obstructing the sinuses or the airway, then you have to fix that because if you do mouth taping and you've got an obstructive airway, you could lead to serious problems, hypoxia or suffocation. So in those particular patients, you have to go to an experienced ENT or, there's certain dentists now, dental medicine professionals who are airway specialists, and they can do imaging. They can look at the opening of your airway, and a lot of times you've got to pull the jaw forward, some appliances, and then fix the anatomy to where you can actually do nasal breathing with an unobstructive airway to where, and we fix the enzyme. Now you can, produce nitric oxide, deliver nitric oxide, and really overcome sleep apnea, a lot of pulmonary issues, hypoxia at night. And so that's what we focus on. And again, but making sure that you have the anatomy and the structures that you're not obstructed.
I read about some exercise that when you block one side and start to do unilateral breathing through the nose, try to force it, that will improve blood flow. Can that also enhance nitric oxide?
Again, all of that is dependent upon if the enzyme is coupled and active. Because when you activate and stimulate nitric oxide production, that again is part of the intracellular signaling that tells that cell, I need nitric oxide. I'm trying to turn you on. And so we have to maintain NOS function, and we have to maintain, and the rate limiting step in that is oxidation of tetrahydrobiopterin, or we call BH4. So you have to maintain a certain ratio of BH4 to BH2. And in people with what's called a methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase issue, or SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, then they can't reduce biopterin tetrahydrobiopterin. So the patient with either a homozygous or heterozygous SNP and MTHFR
Yep.
can't maintain that redox balance, so they have an uncoupled NOS. They have endothelial dysfunction. So then we have to give them a little extra support. But if we can prevent oxidation and the loss of electrons from BH4, then we can maintain NOS function, NOS coupling, and we can activate nitric oxide production in the endothelium and in the epithelium.
And you talked about just now about the MTHFR gene abnormality.
So in Caucasians, it's estimated that 45 to 55% of American Caucasians have either a heterozygous or homozygous single nucleotide polymorphism in this MTHFR. And what that means is there's a problem in the genetic coding, right? So you're not getting a functional copy of that protein that would be active for its enzymatic function. So people thought for years that it's a problem in methylation, and it is. But in biochemistry, a lot of these, they're cogs in a wheel, right? So the metabolites from one enzyme reaction feeds into another, and you get this metabolic shuttling. What we're finding in terms of MTHFR, it's not just a methylation issue, but as I mentioned, it's a transfer of electrons to reduce biopterin to tetrahydrobiopterin, and then tetrahydrobiopterin feeds into the nitric oxide synthase enzyme and acts as an electron carrier to promote the 5-electron oxidation of L-arginine to nitric oxide. So without BH4 feeding into the NOS, then the NOS enzyme doesn't make nitric oxide, it makes superoxide. It reduces molecular oxygen to superoxide instead of making nitric oxide from L-arginine.
Mhm.
So it's a huge problem, and you need to know if you have this MTHFR SNP because there's certain things you have to do to overcome this genetic deficiency.
Supplementing in methylfolate and B complex can help in restoring some of the dysfunctionality in this gene.
That helps, but also understanding and taking actions to stop a lot of oxidative stress, right? Because oxidative stress, oxidation in terms of biochemistry is a loss of an electron, and a reduction is a gain of electrons. So every biochemical reaction in the human body is just a transfer of electrons. It's oxidation, reduction. And so if you have too much oxidation, you're oxidizing a lot of these biomolecules, so you have to have an excess of electrons to have reducing equivalents to prevent the oxidative stress. And when we look in the cell, individual cells, it's an overexpression of NADPH oxidase. And there's some populations, African Americans, for example, have an overexpression of NADPH oxidase. It's an uncoupled electron transport chain, and it's an uncoupled NOS enzyme that contributes to oxidative stress. So we've got to minimize superoxide production. We've got to recouple the electron transport chain of the mitochondria. And we have to make sure that we maintain optimal nitric oxide production because nitric oxide actually inhibits oxidative stress from these three primary sources.
So through that's done through supplementing. So the two supplements we talked about and avoiding oxidative stress. So probably inflammatory food. And what else can they do you recommend people with abnormal MTHFR to do?
I mean, eating a kind of an anti-inflammatory diet, a lot of antioxidants you have to supplement with. And what we do in terms of developing product technology is we provide components in there that recouple the NOS enzyme, that mitigate oxidative stress, that reduce inflammation. In fact, many of my patents are on a method of reducing inflammation, reducing triglycerides, and improving nitric oxide production. But yeah, it's mainly, if you're smoking, you got to stop. Moderate physical exercise, a balanced diet in moderation, complete elimination of sugar. Sugar causes oxidative stress. And really the science is pretty complex, but many times the solution is pretty simple. It's what we've known for decades or centuries that confer health benefits and disease prevention. A good diet, moderate exercise, elimination of toxins, and then repleting missing nutrients in the body.
Speaking of complex science, hypertension is very complicated disease. Are there any clinical trials with hypertension and role of nitric oxide?
Yeah, we've published several papers on the role of nitric oxide in affecting hypertension, specifically resistant hypertension. And in these studies, what we took was we took naive hypertensive patients, meaning that they were untreated, because we just wanted to see, can nitric oxide itself manage blood pressure? And for me, this made perfect sense because what we knew is that if your body can't make nitric oxide, we can't dilate the blood vessels, right? And so we have a finite amount of blood that's pumping through all blood vessels throughout the body. right? If we can't make nitric oxide, then these blood vessels become chronically constricted. So now we've got a finite volume of blood pumping through smaller pipes. And physics tell us that pressure goes up. These are basic fundamental laws of physics. And if we give nitric oxide and we dilate the blood vessels, now we've got that same volume of blood going through bigger pipes and pressure comes down. Again, these are laws of physics. So to test that, we took patients with high blood pressure, we just give them nitric oxide. I make a nitric oxide releasing lozenge, and we find that blood pressure comes down. So we solve the physics problem. Nitric oxide solves the physics problem of high blood pressure. And we find now that we can, within 20 minutes of taking my lozenge, we improve arterial compliance by 20%. So we dampen the pulse wave with each beat of the heart. And then we also find that within 20 minutes and even 4 hours later, we've improved the function of the enzyme by 15 to sometimes 25%. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, then we do it for you, but we're fixing the reason your body can't make nitric oxide. And we find blood pressure improves, we lower triglycerides, we lower inflammation, a C-reactive protein, we improve exercise performance, we improve cerebral blood flow, we improve, blood flow to the sex organs, and we improve mitochondrial function. So again, as long as we give nitric oxide and restore the production of nitric oxide, we see the benefits of it systemically.
And how long does the effect of the nitric oxide lozenges last in um, for the blood pressure control? Does it stay hours or longer?
Well, we measured this through 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure measurement. And so we take and we get baseline blood pressure, we give them the lozenge, and then usually within 15 or 20 minutes, we start to see blood pressure come down. And I think a very important point here is that if you have normal blood pressure or low blood pressure, your blood pressure doesn't drop with nitric oxide, at least at the doses that we're administering through our orally disintegrating tablet. But if you have high blood pressure, within 15 or 20 minutes, it'll come down. And it'll start to normalize, and usually that lasts about 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours. And then upon a single administration, you may start to see the blood pressure start to go up. So in that case, we say one lozenge every 12 hours, but everybody's different because the etiology of hypertension is pretty complex. Is it because of renin-angiotensin problem? Is it a calcium issue? Is it heavy metals that are scavenging nitric oxide causing hypertension? So everybody's different. And so the dosing depends upon the individual patient. We published in 2011 a pediatric patient with a rare genetic disorder who had resistant severe hypertension in the intensive care unit of, blood pressure of 210 over 115 and no prescription medication, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, calcium channel antagonists, even beta blockers were insufficient at managing his blood pressure. And so what we found with him, we started dosing him with our lozenge, and within 4 hours, we brought his blood pressure down to 130 over 80. But we found that we had to dose him every 4 hours to manage his blood pressure because after 4 hours, it'd start to go back up, so we had to dose him again. So the point here is it depends upon the etiology of the hypertension. But for most people and what we say in the general population, one lozenge every 12 hours is typically sufficient to manage blood pressure. But we also see these extreme cases that we know taking one lozenge every 4 hours is completely safe because we monitored this kid for methemoglobin formation. And we found that that was necessary for managing his blood pressure with no signs of toxicity.
And if someone with hypertension is watching this and hearing about the nitric oxide that is promising, is there a specific study whether you have done or you would like to reference to that they can look at?
Yeah, it would be that clinical study we published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2011. Because that shows, number one, it explains the etiology of this particular patient's hypertension. And we're continuing to do the studies on high blood pressure. But and so those are products that we've tested in terms of these are dietary supplement products that we have on the market. But I have a drug company called Bryan Therapeutics where we're developing specific drug therapy for things like ischemic heart disease. We're not going to do a trial on hypertension for drug therapy because I think what we're what I believe is that when we get a drug approved for ischemic heart disease, that's more effective and safer than isosorbide or organic nitrates. And then we've got a drug for Alzheimer's we're developing. That once we get these drugs approved and on the market, physicians will recognize and find that it's effective at managing the high blood pressure, which is contributing to the advancement and progression of these endpoint diseases, ischemic heart disease or Alzheimer's. So I believe that they'll use these prophylactically and off-label for the resistant hypertensive patients. So I don't think we'll have a need to go through the expense and rigor of doing a hypertension study for these nitric oxide drugs because it'll be used off-label. And because it's really addressing the root cause of these more advanced chronic diseases and indications that manifest years later as a result of nitric oxide deficiency.
And the nitric oxide method of delivery is the lozenges, right?
It's a lozenge. So we have to remember nitric oxide is a gas. It's not a pill you can swallow or a tablet you can take. So based on my 25 years of research and discoveries, we found that if your body can't make nitric oxide, then we got to do it for you, right? And this isn't something new that I discovered because this has been used in the clinical care unit since 30 years, since the 1980s, where they would give premature babies, the most vulnerable, high-risk patient population in the world, inhaled nitric oxide to reduce pulmonary pressures in neonatal pulmonary hypertension with very good results. It saved millions of lives. And even now, today, even though it's not approved for adults, many physicians use it during cardiopulmonary bypass to maintain tissue oxygenation, blood oxygen saturation, and even in pulmonary hypertensive patients. So the challenge for me was how do we administer nitric oxide gas in an outpatient setting safely and effectively? And so I do this through an orally disintegrating tablet. In fact, I'll show you how it works, but it's a simple lozenge. And so you just put it in your mouth, and then as it's dissolving, it's releasing nitric oxide. So I create this matrix that this matrix falls apart, it produces 20 to 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas. And that's the same amount you would administer therapeutically in a neonatal intensive care unit. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, we're doing it for you. So if I had an ultrasound here, I could show you within 12 seconds my carotid arteries dilating. So it's vasoactive, it's dilating blood vessels, it's improving arterial compliance. And because it's an orally disintegrating tablets, it's completely changing my microbiome. It's killing the pathogens, it's restoring the ecology of the non-pathogenic commensal bacteria, and we know that it's restoring the function of the NOS enzyme. The NOS enzyme in my endothelial cells, the NOS enzyme in my epithelial cells. So now if I do nasal breathing while this lozenge is in my mouth, it's delivering nitric oxide to the lower airways, improving blood oxygen saturation, matching ventilation to perfusion. And we've seen this in patients with COPD, emphysema, COVID, the hypoxemia associated with COVID. We could see with this lozenge, this single lozenge here, we had a drug trial during COVID. We could take patients with a blood oxygen saturation of 78 and within 6 minutes improve their blood oxygen saturation to 96. Just
Yeah.
breathing room air and improving nitric oxide delivery.
Are there reliable ways to test for nitric oxide?
Not clinically. There's no blood measures you can measure, like for vitamin D or cholesterol, for example. Years ago, I developed a salivary test strip that I really don't use anymore because if you know what it's measuring, it can be a useful indicator, but it can lead to a lot of false positives. So really what we rely on are symptoms. And so if you have ED, that's a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. If your blood pressure is elevated, anything over 120 over 80, it's a sign of nitric oxide deficiency. If you have metabolic disease, it's a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. So that's what we look for. But then, I say there's really only two people in the world who need nitric oxide. There's the people who are sick and want to get healthy. And then there's the people who are healthy and don't want to get sick. So if you fall in one of those two categories, I recommend you take nitric oxide. And, I've been taking my product now for probably 20 years. And I take it not because I need it, I take it because I don't want to need it, right? I want to maintain optimal nitric
Prevention.
oxide production,
Mhm.
make sure my enzyme is coupled, make sure that the bacteria are the right bacteria so my body can naturally produce nitric oxide.
Last question. Could you please summarize to us the most important takeaways from this interview?
People need to be aware of what nitric oxide is, what it does, and what they may be doing on their daily life that may be contributing to a loss of nitric oxide production. Because here's what we know. Over 200,000 papers published in the scientific literature. Your body cannot and will not heal or perform optimally without nitric oxide. Loss of nitric oxide is the earliest event in the onset and progression of disease. And if you can maintain optimal nitric oxide production, then with the science, basic science and clinical data are telling us that you can live a long, healthy life free of disease. And I think that's what everybody's goal should be. It's, to live as long as we can, as healthy as we can. We're not immortal beings. Nobody gets out alive, but I think our goal is to live the longest, healthiest life we can, and we can leave a lasting impact, make the world a better place and, keep advancing the science to where we can live a longer, healthier life.
Dr. Bryan, thank you very much for sharing your insight and your knowledge, and thank you for all of the important work that you do in helping us understand nitric oxide. And can you tell us about the book?
So I'll tell you that this is a new book I just published a couple of months ago, but it chronicles this story of nitric oxide, how it was discovered, what led to a Nobel Prize, and really chronicles my personal, journey of discovery and how we've been able to understand the science and then translate that into, product technology and drug therapy. But
Yeah.
uh,
Could
really,
you tell?
that book summarizes everything that we discussed over the past, 45 or 50 minutes. You can find it at nathansbook.com, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere books are sold.
We will link all of those. You said they can order it from your website and Amazon.
You can get it at Amazon. If you go to nathansbook.com, it'll link you to Amazon or our website or Barnes and Noble. But yeah, it's available anywhere. It's a bestseller on Amazon. It's working its way up New York Times list. So it's been very well received, and I'm very thankful for my agent Alan Morrell and the publisher Brick Tower Press. They've done a good job of getting the word out there.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. And among all of also your lots of research and very well published in nitric oxides. Thank you also for all of that great work.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. Good
Good,
being with you.
good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.